Thank you so much. What a wonderful crowd. I wish we were actually in the bookshop. Welcome to the book launch for Valentine Ackland of Transgressive Life by Frances Bingham. I'm Erica Gillingham of Gaze the Word Bookshop, and I welcome you all here this evening for this wonderful talk. So yes, thank you so much. We're going to start this evening with some visual descriptions of ourselves for anyone who would like the visual assistance, and then I will do the formal introductions. So I'll start off. As I said, I'm Erica Gillingham of Gaze the Word. I'm a bookseller there, as well as a writer and an academic. I am a white woman in my mid-30s who identifies as queer. I'm sitting in my office surrounded by all of my queer books, including Valentine Ackland and Footnotes to Sex, as well as the poster for Gaze the Word Bookshop. Mia, can you do a visual description for us?
Sure. Hello. So I'm Mia Farlane, and I've got white blonde hair and dark blue eyes. I'm wearing a navy blue shirt, and I'm somewhere between Mia Wasikowska and Mia Farrow in age, and I'm sitting in front of one of my mother's bookcases in Aotearoa, so Morena. If you're awake better here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mia. Mia is also in New Zealand at the moment, so thank you for getting up early for us. And Frances, can you do a visual description for us?
Yes, I'm in London. I'm in my workspace. This is in the studio that I share with my partner. So it's full of clay and paint, as well as the books and some of her artworks that you can see behind me. I'm from an English Scots background, and I'm white with short dark hair. And in honor of Valentine, I'm wearing a suit today. It's brown with a blue check, blue paisley shirt, and a very natty copper tie, which I hope you can see is glimmering in the light. I'm wearing these retro tortoiseshell specs, which I have to wear for looking at the screen at the moment, because I've got some problems with light sensitivity from the screen. So sometimes I have to look away from the screen for a bit. So please excuse me if I do that. I'm not absenting myself from the conversation. I'm just glancing away for a moment. Thanks, Erica.
Author you so much. All right, and let me properly introduce you as well. So Mia Farlane is an author. Her first novel, Footnotes to Sex, was praised by Sarah Waters as subtle, smart, and very funny. Farlane's latest novel, Parallel Hell, darkly humorous literary fiction set in London and Wellington, New Zealand, is a deep dive into a suicide-obsessed mind. Farlane completed Parallel Hell while on leave from South Bank's National Poetry Library, thanks to a creative New Zealand grant. Are You Okay? A writing event, her creative nonfiction in Moxie magazine, explores the boundaries between author and character in this novel. Also, if you are interested in having your name put in for a draw for a signed copy of Parallel Hell, you can join Mia's monthly mailing list, Farlane on French Writers. And Frances Bingham, the author of the evening. Frances Bingham writes across the literary spectrum, focusing on gender transgressive lives like her own. As editor of Journey from Winter, Selected Poems of Valentine Ackland, she was described by Ali Smith as Ackland's critical guardian angel. Maureen Duffy praised her novel, The Principle of Camouflage, as a true work of imagination. And Mimi Calvati called her recent book, which I've got here, London Panopticon, a vision, a love song, a pilgrimage, a perfect union of image and word. Plays include Comrade Ackland and I, which was recently repeated on BBC Radio 4, so you can check that out later, and The Blue Hour of Natalie Barney. Frances was awarded an Authors Foundation grant while writing Valentine Ackland, A Transgressive Life. Thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute joy to be launching your book, your biography of Valentine Ackland. So Mia, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, thanks very much, Erica. And it's wonderful to be here at this Gaze the Word event with you, Frances. I loved reading your book, and I've got lots of questions to ask you. So I'll begin. Before Sylvia Townsend Warner first met the poet Valentine Ackland in 1927, you say that she, Sylvia, had heard about the trousers, if not the poetry. So perhaps we could begin, like Sylvia Townsend Warner, with first appearances. Could you talk about the stunning cover of your book, Valentine Ackland, A Transgressive Life, and the poet's what I'd call good looks and charm?
Yes, well, I'm so glad you like the cover, because I'm very, very, very pleased with it. And you can see it here. Anyone who's escaped seeing it so far, here it is, with this fabulous Eric Gill portrait of Valentine from the 1920s. And you can see the whole drawing, it's actually a nude. So there's this remarkable contrast between the masculine looking head with the eaten crop and the female body, which was the very fashionable androgyny of the moment. So she also modeled for Augustus John, the sculptor Elizabeth Muntz, a photographer called Frau Rice, who later pictured Marlene Dietrich, and was, you know, greatly in demand as a model because of these remarkable androgynous looks. But the next photos that we're going to see, photo number 2, shows her as when she was still Molly, as a debutante, just back from finishing school. And Sylvia Townsend Warner was very proud of Valentine's beauty as a young woman before they met. And I think in this image of her before she transformed herself into Valentine, you can still see in the pose the kind of daring creature who once, for a bet, walked down the Savoy ballroom staircase wearing a backless green evening gown with a monocle. And photo number 3, the next one, is going to show us Valentine after she'd identified as Valentine. So she's had her short hair cut, she's wearing trousers, and she's looking much more sort of striking and unusual, as she was when she was drawn by Gill at the time when she was having affairs with film star Anna May Wong, Nancy Cunard, Dorothy Warren. But the transformation's still in progress. You can notice that the shoes she's wearing are still quite feminine, these white strappy shoes. But the photo after this shows her wearing her tie in Cholden, being the sort of country gent outside her cottage. And the transformation is complete now. This photograph was given me by Sylvia's cousin, Janet, who said it was very characteristic of Valentine. And photo number 5, the next one, this is the classic image of Valentine with her somewhat phallic gun, I think, and challenging gaze. Also, if you look at it closely, I think it looks as though she's packing, but, you know, perhaps that's just the bullets in her pocket, who can say? And the photo after this, the one on the left, is Valentine and Sylvia together. It's a photo taken in the mirror. So Valentine's looking down into the box camera. So it's a kind of 1930s version of a selfie. And the right-hand one, Sylvia fording the river. I love this photograph of Sylvia Townsend Warner. It's so informal, and she's got a cigarette sticking out of her mouth. I think this is just the perfect vision of what she was actually like. Thank you so much, Erica. That's brilliant. So we can, that one's in the next lot. Thank you. So we get some idea of the looks from the portraits, the photos, but I think the charm is more fugitive to capture. But we have got some pointers. People always talk about her voice, that she had this voice that was very low and musical, beautiful voice.
Love that that you call it viola in the book, which is so perfect because the viola is longer than the violin, and you have the lower sound, and in that Sylvia Townsend Warner was a musicologist to begin with. She'd have had that ear for her voice, wouldn't she?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Valentine was tall. She was very tall.
It all fits. It all fits exactly, doesn't it? And I've actually heard a recording of her voice, And it is like that. It's very musical, very low, and to us, unimaginably posh. You know, she's got this kind of 1930s received pronunciation and then some. It's very, very, very posh kind of drawl. And her manner was also, people always commented on it, it was very sophisticated. She'd been to this Paris finishing school to learn poise, which she described as the best armor I know against extreme shyness. So her manner was very courteous and gallant, and people always talked about that and admired it as well. And Sylvia always talked about the impression of strength that she gave, competence, skill, ease, power. And I mean, I think obviously to Sylvia, the suggestion of sexual power that goes with that. But I think the most surprising thing about her charm is that apparently she was very fun to be with. There were lots of jokes, daft things fooling around, you know. One example of that I liked a lot was she bought a new raincoat, which would have been, you know, a kind of posh Burberry sort of thing. She wanted to test how rainproof it was. Of course, it wouldn't rain. So she put the coat on and she made Sylvia and Janet stand on chairs in the garden with soda water siphons and empty them onto her to see how waterproof the coat was, which I think is a kind of inspired daft thing to do. And there's another thing that she wrote in her diary that I like very much, which is about female handkerchiefs. So she hated female handkerchiefs because they were sort of stupid little lacy things that weren't any good to anybody. And she wrote in her diary, female handkerchiefs, male noses bigger, more blown, or males grander, more powerful. Society for providing larger handkerchiefs for women, or society for encouraging women's larger noses. And then when I thought about that, I thought, is there something a bit phallic going on there as well? You know, the nose thing, but I thought perhaps we won't go down that path at the moment. But anyway, so I think those things kind of give us an idea of what her charm was like.
She's a fabulous character, and the book, your book, it reads like a novel. Even though you say, and I'll quote, there is no fictional writing here. If there's a conversation, it's a conversation somebody noted down. If a fast car drives along a lane between summer hedgerows, it did. It's a true story, but it reads like a page-turner novel. Would you like to read some of the first chapter?
Yes, I will. I will read just the first paragraph of the first chapter, Becoming Valentine. One November evening in 1925, two young women from London arrived at the village of Chalden in Dorset. They brought with them 2 suitcases, a gramophone, and a wooden box full of records, the bare necessities. Both wore trousers, unheard of then, except among perverts, and had Eton cropped hair. But this was the androgynous fashion of the moment. They were not a couple. The taller of the two, Mrs. Turpin, had come to the country to recover from a recent operation to remove her hymen. Her friend, Mrs. Braden, thought this was tremendously funny.
It's a very dramatic beginning, and I wondered whether it occurred to you if this story would make a great biopic. How did you achieve this effect?
Well, it is that kind of story. I thought that audiences of films and plays and readers of fiction are very used to being introduced to the character in the middle, and then gradually putting mosaic pieces of information together to build up discoveries about them. And this process really engages the interest and intrigues us. And I didn't see why the same method shouldn't work in a biography, as long as there were those ground rules about no fictional writing, and make it a different experience. So it's a transgressive life as a biography, as well as a biography of a transgressive life. But primarily, biography is a story, and so the drama is really important. And, you know, Valentine liked to dramatize her own life and tell it as a story repeatedly in many different versions. So I thought it was quite legitimate to write it that way. And I tried to do it slightly unconventionally. For example, it was a terrible shock to Valentine when she found out that her American lover, Elizabeth Wade White, had taken up with someone else during the war in Valentine's absence. But to tell the reader that fact chronologically before Valentine knew it would, put us in a kind of godlike position of foreknowledge and completely spoil the reveal later when Valentine finds out and is furious. And I wanted to
sorry, go on. No, I was just going to say, you use that expression later quite a few times in the book, and it does work so well. You finish.
I've lost it, Mia. You carry on.
Oh, okay, sorry. So, yeah, you froze for a moment there too.
Yeah, sorry.
Or I did. Yes, so later, you use that expression a few times in the book. Later, they would become implacable enemies, for example, which gives a great sense of foreboding. And really, I felt as though I was in the story, caught up in it as if you were there. Could you talk more about what you also say in the introduction about how you wanted the reader to get to know Valentine in a very natural way, which I think is far more engaging?
Yes, I didn't want it to be the sort of traditional old style biography, that sort of starts 3 generations back before the person it's about is even born, and then goes through their childhood in enormous detail without any reference to their future life. So you don't really know what's going to happen, why you're reading it.
You end up skipping bits as well, don't you?
Well, I think people do skip or fall by the wayside completely sometimes, don't actually make it. So I just wanted to do it a bit differently and allow the reader to enjoy the puzzle of personality, that there's sometimes kind of conflicting clues, and examine the evidence and gradually get to know Valentine like a fictional character or somebody that you've just met who might turn into a friend or not. And it is a familiar experience, isn't it? If you meet somebody as an adult and then you hear about their childhood later in flashback. And I wanted to sort of replicate that in the book, and that feeling that as you discover more about their background, it sometimes explains things that you've already observed about their character. As you say, it's a natural way to meet a person.
Could you introduce the main characters to us?
Yeah, well, we first meet Valentine at 19 years old, at this crucial point in her life, as she leaves this disastrous 6-month marriage, which has culminated in the kind of medicalized rape of having her hymen removed. And she's going to reinvent herself as an independent, trouser-wearing gender rebel and change her name from Molly to Valentine. And shortly afterwards, she meets Sylvia Townsend Warner, best-selling author, 12 years older, who's a kind of whirlwind of intelligence and chic, whose poetry Valentine very much admires. And their meeting is not a great success.
I thought was very Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they hate each other first, and then we learn more about their backgrounds as they learn about each other's and what brought them to this point before the story moves forward.
Before I go on to the next question, I'd be curious to know if you've ever wondered who would play Valentine Ackland in a biopic.
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Well, they'd have to be tall and they'd have to be able to pass as a man. Did you see Janet McTeer in Portrait of a Marriage being Vita Sackville-West? So she's got the height and she's also got the posh accent.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I thought of Janet McTeer as well. I mean, I was thinking of her in Albert Nobbs.
Yes, the cross-dressing thing. Yeah, absolutely. Or Suran Jones, Gentleman Jack. She'd have to have her hair cut and lose her Yorkshire accent and everything. But, she's got the height anyway. Someone like that.
Right. I'd love to go and see that film. Biopic. And Tove Jansson, Tove, there was a film last year. It was a box office hit in in Finland, wasn't it? So anyway, moving on from appearances, perhaps we could talk about Valentine Ackland, the poet. You write that Valentine saw herself firstly as a poet. Also, Claire Harmon said at the 2016 National Poetry Library event, the special editions event in 2016, where am I? She said that Valentine was the poet whose gifts she venerated. And from your book, this is what Sylvia Warner says, which I think would make a great endorsement about Valentine's poems. A true pleasure to read them, though sometimes rather a shy pleasure, for it's rare to find poetry that is genuinely out of its author. I like your way of writing, the lines that are sleek and cold, like the pebbles the sea has but just now left. And I like to your sparseness. Would you like to read the poem Reading My Own Works?
Yes. This is a good poem to start with, because it is Valentine, her own voice, addressing the reader directly. I hear my own voice over the desert of days. Across the sandy stretch of the war, I see my own words, and I had almost forgotten that once I could speak. You, who read words when you want them, who turn on the tap of a book, who pour a poem half emptied down drain. It is urgent, you understand, how bounteous the words looked, how coolly the mirage flowed over sand.
Thank you. Perhaps you could give us a brief overview of Valentine's poetry, how it changed over the years and the types of poetry she wrote.
Yes, well, she started writing poetry as a child, and her first poem was actually published while she was still at school in an anthology called Modern Poetry, you know, not a children's anthology, an adult one. She found her own voice in a romantic, modernist, lyrical style. She wrote love poems to women. She's been described as one of the most hauntingly erotic poets of the century. She also wrote pastoral poems, setting her unique identity within the English landscape, the kind of figure in the landscape, exploring her sexuality and gender identity in that context. But her political commitment to give a voice to the silenced and other outsiders began with passionate revolutionary poetry, which she wrote when she was a communist and volunteered for the Spanish Civil War. And later this developed into anti-war protest poems. She wrote about Hiroshima, she wrote about Vietnam, and laments about the desecration of the natural world, elegies for the loss of the environment. And I see her as a kind of queer witness to the 20th century, writing on important issues of her time. And lastly, later in her life, she also wrote spiritual poetry. She'd got the kind of modernist obsession with capturing the nature of the moment. But she also wrote about the soul's quest, the journey towards enlightenment and acceptance of death and human mortality.
I think I'm right in saying that the latest book is Journey from Winter, that you edited, selected poems from Fifield Cup 2008. Could you tell us the other publications?
Yes, of course. I'll just add that this lovely book, Journey from Winter, is still in print and available from all good bookshops, and it has a great selection of Valentine's work in it if you're interested in it. So there was a 30-year gap since the previous book, which was in 1978, one called Further Poems, published by Julius Lipton, who was an old communist ally of Valentine's. Then before that, in 1973, The Nature of the Moment was Sylvia Warner's own selection of Valentine's poems. It's a very beautiful selection, but I think it does rather tend towards the sadder of the poems. So those were all posthumous books because she died in 1969. So the only major poetry book in her lifetime came out when she was still in her 20s in 1934, and that was Whether a Dove or Seagull, which was her first book with Sylvia Townsend Warner. So both the poets contributed over 50 poems each. So it's a long book with, at its core, an exchange of love poems between the two writers. And that whole book is reprinted in Journey from Winter. And the poems were anonymous, so that they hoped that they'd be judged by the poem itself, not by who wrote which one.
So how was the book received? And perhaps you could talk about how Valentine's poetry was received in general.
Yes, well, it was quite strange with Whether a Dove or Seagull, really, because the reviews were really positive. But Valentine had imagined that, like Byron, she would wake up and find herself famous, that everybody would immediately have recognized her genius. So although they were very good reviews, she was still quite disappointed in them. And one thing that was a problem was that the anonymous authorship did distract people, because they tended to just guess who'd written which poem, like it was a sort of game. And of course, they tended to think that all of the stronger poems were Sylvia's and the weaker poems were Valentine's, which was not at all the case. In fact, there were actually some rather weak poems by both of them in there, as well as some very strong ones. So it didn't work doing that. But what was not so pleasant was, I think that, in fact, a lot of people did pick up on the lesbian eroticism in the book. And they didn't like it at all. Robert Frost, who the book was dedicated to, described it as emasculating. And he wrote to a friend, "I am chilled to the marrow, as in the actual presence of some foul form of death, where none of me can function." Which, I mean, I think that's comical castration anxiety, really. But at the same time, you know, in terms of the hostility to the book, it is, even from another poet, it is still rather appalling. And I think that it did actually colour the reception of all Valentine's later poetry, that she was seen as a lesbian, a communist, and a younger poet in Sylvia Townsend Warner's shadow, who had published, you know, kind of nepotism, I suppose, published with Sylvia just to get her book out. And after that, she never published another major book in her lifetime. She was quite successful in a modest way in terms of lots of poetry magazines, Time and Tide, London Mercury, Life and Letters Today, so quite prestigious magazines, couple of pamphlets. She was included in lots of anthologies. She broadcast on BBC Radio. So, you know, it wasn't a bad career by most people's standards, but she'd imagined this kind of magnificent Byronic genius thing. So it seemed to her more disappointing, I think, than it actually was.
So she was very frustrated, but she persevered, didn't she?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. She was frustrated by the lack of audience, the relatively small recognition, and this sort of constant struggle to publish. But she did keep the faith. And this was her identity. And it was also, she felt it was her duty, that she had this gift and she must use it. I think she was very lucky to have Sylvia as her first reader, who had total belief in her as a poet. And Sylvia said that Valentine had felt that it would be a sin against her light if she stopped writing poetry. And I think that says it all, really. She even wrote poetry about not being able to write poetry, which I love.
Absolutely,
yes, that's great poems.
A good idea, a good role model there. So when I first came to read Valentine Ackland, Transgressive Life, first I read the dedication, and then I went to the back of the book and I looked at the acknowledgements, and I loved the dedication to your mother, the biographer and historian Caroline Bingham, and in the acknowledgements, the non-dedication to your partner, the studio potter and lettering artist Liz Matthews. Do you talk about their contribution and influence in the making of this book? and how you came to write about Valentine Ackland.
Yes, of course. Well, my mother, Caroline Bingham, was a professional writer. And Mia, you know what this is like. Your mother is the New Zealand novelist Marilyn Duckworth, and your aunt, the poet Fleur Adcock. So, you know, having role models like this is enormously influential on your idea of the writer's life as a possibility. And my mother published many books. Her first was The Making of a King, which you might be able to just see here on the shelf behind me, I don't know, which was an innovative biography about the youth, only the youth of King James VI and First, which started with his death. It came out to great acclaim when I was a small child, and I'm very, very proud of her achievements. So I thought it would be very appropriate for me to dedicate this book to her. In a more specific way, I think I actually first heard of Valentine from my mother. She asked if I knew about Valentine's life with Sylvia Townsend Warner. So in a way, she introduced us. And then I went on to read Sylvia's diary, edited by Claire Harmon, from which Valentine emerges as this wild, weird character who was so deeply loved by Sylvia. And then I chanced to read some of Valentine's actual poetry in an anthology, Women's Poetry of the 1930s, edited by Jane Dowson. And I was amazed that her work wasn't better known. Her voice just sort of hailed me off the page, and I decided that I really wanted to write about her. As for Liz and the non-dedication to her, she's contributed so much to this book. She'd been with me throughout the whole process. We did all the research trips together. Many of the photos in the book are taken by Liz. We've discussed these extraordinary lives endlessly. So many of her ideas and insights are incorporated into the book. And some while after it was finished, I was seriously ill at home with COVID. And like many others, it's left me with some long-term problems, which mean that I can't work on the screen, which is not good for the editing process, as you can imagine, which Liz made possible for me. So as I say in the acknowledgements, quite literally, the book wouldn't be here without her. No, I wouldn't be here without her, and neither would I. Also, I'm very grateful to Liz for the very beautiful artworks she's made, setting Valentine's words, which we're going to see in a slide later.
There's clearly a lot of work that's gone into this book, and it's true that when you grow up with a writer, you see that writing is work. It involves dedication and time. I'd like to talk with you about research. Your book, it's a very witty book, laugh out loud funny in many places, and I could give examples, but it would be a series of spoilers. It's to do with your occasional understated comments. And I think this ability to bring such subtle humor to the writing comes from a real understanding of your subject as a gendered transgressive and as a writer yourself. I'd love to hear about the practical aspect of the research, which is so thorough, how Mi5 helped you, for example. And it must have been so fun to spend time at the Valentine Ackland archive and the Bodleian Library. Could you talk about the books, the material, papers?
Yes, I'd love to. Well, it was almost 20 years ago when I started the original research for this book. And in those days, the Warner Ackland archive was housed in Dorchester Museum in an attic, which was lined with oak cupboards. And every single cupboard was absolutely crammed with papers. So it was a kind of totally haphazard treasury. And there were dozens of notebooks and diaries and manuscript books of all kinds, all crammed with poems and, you know, notes, quotes, lists, reminders, prayers, jokes, menus, fragments of ideas. And there were also shopping lists, photos, postcards, Christmas cards, love letters, telegrams. There was a hotel room card for Mr. and Mrs. Ackland, which they'd obviously taken out of the door and kept. And everything smelt of their house, which was very damp because the river ran past it. So smelt of kind of damp river water and gauloise. And I imagined the vanishing trace of scent from the writer's wrist. It was very, very evocative and full of sort of fascinating little fragments. One of the things that I found there that I particularly liked was this shopping list of Valentine's, which is just a miniature biography in itself on a tiny little piece of paper. And it said, coffee, tip, parking, shrimps, bullets, petrol. And I thought, I really hardly need to write the book on it. I could just sort of publish that and you know exactly what she was like. But more recently, I went to the National Archives at Kew to study the released Mi5 documents, which was a total contrast. You can imagine lots of security, very, strict about access, and you can only look at a few boxes of stuff at a time. When they bought one of these boxes, it was absolutely fascinating. These faded brown folders with top secret stamped on them in red. And inside, lists of all of the post that had been intercepted. And so it said, what books they got out of the London Library, how many cigarettes they'd ordered from Dunhill, a lot, and copies of their personal letters, which had been opened, copied, and then sent on to them. So there was a huge amount of very personal stuff there. And the sense of intrusion into their private life was really, invasion was really very chilling. And it also made me think about the areas in which Valentine and Sylvia had kind of cooperated or even manipulated future biographers by preserving this paper heap so carefully in their archive, in a complete contrast to this, where there was no question of consent or collusion because they had no idea this surveillance was happening. So it's kind of all secret stuff.
I was so interested to read what the Mi5, the description of Valentine Ackland when she was in court, and she didn't know the description was being made of her, a whole page, whereas you've got just one line or two about Sylvia Townsend-Warner.
Absolutely.
Who was also in court.
Absolutely. And that I think is partly because they were Mi5 were interested not only in the communism, but also in the abnormality which they perceived as, because Valentine was wearing men's clothes. So Valentine was of greater interest at that point. The abnormality and the communism were one and the same thing in the official mind, both very bad things. Very different atmosphere, Mia, at the National Poetry Library, where you used to work, which holds significant, still work, sorry, but you're in New Zealand at the moment, so.
That I miss.
You miss. You're going to be back. When you're back in London, it's going to be lovely.
Yes, I will be. Yeah.
You will be. So in there are all of Valentine's poetry books, because she made a bequest of all her modern poetry books to the National Poetry Library. And this is absolutely fascinating for a biographer. Many of them, the poems are annotated, and there are draft poems written on lots of the end papers. So this is like a kind of snapshot of the writer's mind, really, what has fed into it, what she liked, what she was interested in reading poetically. And this is also where Liz had the residency and did the installation, which focused on those books and Valentine's own poems. And some other wonderful aspects of the research project were site visits to specific places. In London, the house where Valentine was born, the place she went to school, in Norfolk, in Dorset, we had to, strictly for research purposes, of course, we had to go to the Sailor's Return, which is her local pub, check out the cider there. And we, beautiful walks, beautiful swims, and we stayed at amazing places like Chiddock, which is this remote house on the Downs near the sea, which was lent to us for a not entirely successful weekend by Sylvia's cousin, Janet.
Oh, yes, Janet. So I was going to ask you about your experience of meeting people who knew Valentine, and Janet Macon, Sylvia Townsend Warner's younger cousin, gave you a wonderful gift, didn't she? And a great compliment, more to the point, if you're happy to talk about that.
Yes, I am. Yeah, Janet was a great influence on my idea of what Sylvia and Valentine was like. I first met her at the King's Arms pub in Dorchester, which is an old coaching inn. So it's got one of those archways that the carriages drive through to get to the yard behind. And so we're in that yard, which is now the car park, and we see Janet's car, this old white muddy car, shoot through the archway at enormous speed, but kind of driving to the inn like a Regency coachman. And I said to Liz, you know, she was taught to drive by Valentine, so you can see the speed and the accuracy. It's, you know, very classic. And when my edition of Valentine's poems was published, Janet gave me Valentine's lighter, which I've got here to show you. I don't know if you'll be able to see it very well, but it's crocodile and chrome. So this is crocodile leather on the outside, and then it opens like this. So you've got a portable ashtray to carry with you at all times, so you can smoke anywhere. And then it opens like that, and that's the lighter part inside it. So that was rather a fabulous gift for her to give me.
Beautiful.
And
you can say that about a lighter, but beautiful.
Well, absolutely. And the crocodile skin too is a bit problematic now, but you know, again,
exactly. Yeah.
So please, may we have that photo now, Erica? The next one. So this is Janet with Valentine in the late 1930s, and Janet showed me this photo, and she said, Valentine looks so innocent, doesn't she? But all the time she was lightly stroking my arm, just with the very tips of her fingers, which I think explains why Janet is giving her that look. And really that made me look at all of the photos I'd got in a completely different way. I don't think Valentine does look innocent. I think she's got that kind of hooded, quite mischievous look, actually. And I've got some more photos now of the other places. This is Cholden. On the left, it's the view inland. You can just see the Sailor's Return, the long white building, and the drove road going inland towards the downs there and the heath. And then on the right, this is the view towards the sea. And the building you can see in the far distance in the fold of the downs is Chiddock, where we had our unsuccessful weekend. And the next one is shows.
You write about.
Yes.
Explained in the book.
Yes. This is their house by the river in Froomvow Church. You can see there's a deck overhanging the river, and Valentine used to fish from that deck. And the other one is the part of the river which Sylvia is fording in that earlier photo, still looking exactly the same as it did then. And then the next photo is the National Poetry Library. So I'm going to hand over to you, Mia, to tell us about this one.
Yes, so I'll talk about that one. This is a display that I was involved in putting together at the National Poetry Library in 2008. It was in connection with a special editions event that was happening because of the book coming out, Journey from Winter Selected Poems of Valentine Ackland, that you edited, Fifield Press, Carcanet. The books at the bottom, on the bottom shelf, they all belong to Sylvia Townsend Warner and Valentine Ackland. So there's a book plate in each one of those made by Reynolds Stone, with the words Valentine Ackland and Sylvia Townsend Warner bequest. And if you look, I'm not sure whether you can actually see it here, it might be off the photo, but there's a missing book on the display. So 1, 2, 3 shelves up on the left, and that would be Further Poems, the one that you mentioned, which was published by Julia Slipton in 1978. Someone will have taken that off the shelf and gone to somewhere in the library with this reference copy, so not left the library with it to have a read. I'll just mention, oh, and all of these books, of course, some of them by Valentine Ackland, and there's yours in the center there. Yeah. I see as well. That I must have placed mother
tongue
it now.
Yeah.
So mother tongue. I was going to say that, didn't want to get it wrong. So yeah. So good news. The Poetry Library opening at the end of May. Just to let you know, 28th.
That's nice. That's good news indeed. And the next photo is also in the National Poetry Library.
Yeah, so this is, you can see a few photos there from in between two shelves. In the top left there's the stele by Liz Matthews with some words from a poem by Valentine Ackland. Oh, that's in bigger there. And the exhibition space of the Poetry Library, the installation from when Liz Matthews was the artist in residence there. It's all work from poems by Valentine Ackland, and I think also some poems, extracts from poems from other books that belonged to them both, from memory.
That's right. I think we should also mention the iconic carpet that we can see there.
Oh yeah, yes.
Sorry, thanks, Erica. Yes.
It's also when I first met you both, 2008.
That's right. A happy time. So yes, please. We will go on to the next one, please. Now, sorry. So now we're back in Chalden. This is Valentine and Sylvia's gravestone with both their names. Even before Sylvia's death, she had her name put on the stone so the dates could be added later to be sure they would both be on it. And it also has the Latin tag which Valentine chose, non omnis moriar. I shall not altogether die.
Yes, when I first was reading the book, as I said, I went to the dedication and then I looked at the acknowledgements, and then I started flicking through the book, looking at the illustrations, of course, at the beautiful photos. There are so many, and I stopped at this photo of the tombstone of Valentine Ackland and Sylvia Townsend Warner with the words non omnis moriar, I shall not die, completely from the poem by Horace. But if you understand the poem by Horace, I think it's more than that, because Valentine Ackland had this idea that her soul would live on. So it's not just about her poetry living on, it's her soul, her spirit. She did the spiritual exercise that you talk about in the book to ensure that that would happen. And on the next page of your book, I'll just quote from it. You say, you mentioned something that Sylvia Townsend Warner wrote in her diary 3 years after Valentine Ackland died. It's a dream that she had. Or is it a dream? No, I mustn't say that. I'll just read it. So Sylvia Townsend Warner says, I woke in my sleep. You see, I woke in my sleep, and there she was beside me, in actuality of being, not remembered, not evoked, not a sense of presence, actual. You talk about the bond between Valentine Ackland and Sylvia Townsend Warner, the adamantine impenetrability of their marriage, as you describe it so well, the unbreakableness and the untamable quality of the relationship between the two writers.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I mean, their relationship was so long and survived so much. I think one reading of it is that they were primarily interested in each other above anything else. So even Valentine's affairs with other women in the context of their open relationship tended to be when Sylvia was temporarily distracted, when she was working obsessively on a book, for instance, and it drew her attention swiftly back to Valentine. So at one level, I think this is the clue to the bond. Their love never really settled down into a kind of domestic content, not only because there were all these dramas and crises, but some of which were rather contrived, but also because they, and especially Sylvia, they retained this romantic idea of each other. And Sylvia imagined Valentine as, among other things, a unicorn, a mermaid, a leopard, a true poet, an urbane pirate, and so all these various mythical creatures. And in her diary, she's always admiring Valentine's handsomeness, even if she's at the same time lamenting the fact that she's become a Catholic or she's being unfaithful or whatever it is. And I think that on top of that, they shared the same core values, so that even when they had intellectual differences, they weren't actually disagreeing about their primary beliefs in living true to oneself and maintaining personal integrity, and in art, and not caring at all about conventional society's values.
When I think about Sylvia Townsend-Warner and Valentine Ackland, I think of other creative couples. And so I think, of course, of Avi Bailey and Yue Fanthorpe. And then I think of Tove Jansson and Tuuliki Pietila. And I think of Frances Bingham and Liz Matthews. And I think of other people, and there are other creative couples here too, no doubt. You said at the Sylvia Townsend-Warner event in 2016, Sylvia Townsend-Warner, the poems, she was writing them, many of them, for Valentine. They were each other's first reader. They were each other's audience, not just the ones addressed to each other, but the political poems, the poems about the war. You also described them as living their lives as a work of art. Could you talk more about that?
Yes. So we know they had this shared faith in writing as a vocation, like a sort of belief system, and a way of being politically engaged. But also the importance of creativity to them both could actually shape their life decisions about the events by asking what would provide the best raw material for creativity and for writing poetry. An example of this is that when Valentine was having the affair with Elizabeth Wade White, she wrote in her diary that all the suffering might be good for Sylvia's work. And, you know, quite seriously, and she was absolutely right, because Sylvia wrote the poem cycle Lost Summer, which was set to music by Paul Nordhoff. And then Sylvia played the record of it to Valentine. And Valentine was so distraught that she seriously considered committing suicide. But she never questioned that Sylvia had done the right thing to write the poems, to make them public. You know, she just wished she could have written some poems about it too. So I think they very consciously lived their lives as a work of art, making the life into a story of a particular kind. But I think that they also curated their lives by carefully ensuring that all of those photographs, diaries, letters, poems, and other kinds of writing, their life art, if you like, would be preserved in that archive. And we know that Sylvia expected publication, and Valentine hoped for later recognition of her work. They believed that their life together would be made public and more art would be made out of it. And of course, they were quite right, because here we are talking about them and making new work based on their lives.
Well, thank you very much, Frances. It's been wonderful talking with Ackland's critical guardian angel, to quote Ali Smith from the TLS.
Thank you, Mia. Such interesting questions, such intelligent readings of the book. I really enjoyed talking to you about it. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you both. That was just, so you gave so many snippets of the book, and in reading it myself, you really just bring Valentine to life. And I found myself just kind of sinking into the book quite quickly, and just reading. I was thinking I would read a few pages, and then suddenly I'd read 10, and it was my stop to get off at the tube. So thank you so much for that. And I really hope that everyone here has been enjoying the discussion and the little insights into both Valentine and Sylvia's life. We are running a little bit late. If you do need to leave right at 9 o'clock, that's absolutely fine. I've got 3 questions here from our audience tonight, so we'll go with those, and then we'll close. I'm also going to pop some links to our online bookshop if you are interested in a signed copy. Frances will be coming into the bookshop on Saturday to sign copies of Valentine Ackland, A Transgressive Life. So you can order those online, as well as a copy of Mia's novel, as well as Frances's novel as well. So there. So first question, here we go. Firstly, the question asker says, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you all. Do you know if the Valentine Ackland archive will be in display in the Dorchester Museum when it reopens this summer?
I think there will be some items from it. I don't know anything about this, except that I was asked a factual question about a caption. So there's going to be something that needs captioning when it reopens. At the moment, the archive itself is not in the museum. It's housed in the Dorset History Centre while the museum's been being redone. So that's as much as I know about that.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good technical question. And also, I love that, one of the perks of being a biographer is you get to help fact check, cards for display. This next question I feel is quite politically pertinent to this moment. They say there are some chilling similarities here regards to state invasion of women's private lives rather, especially those considered abnormal, in light of the current undercover policing inquiry. And they're wondering, how might Ackland encourage us to respond to these acts?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the answer is definitely with resistance, but I think also that it's worth being aware that they both knew to their cost that there is a price to be paid for that kind of resistance. They were very strong people who were very well supported, but at the same time, I do think that they both of them did suffer in various ways from they never actually knew for sure about the Mi5 surveillance, but they certainly resisted as best they could all forms of state intervention in that totally inappropriate way.
That's a good message all around. If I can just, underline that. That's great. Lawrence Warner asks, Frances, I was intrigued by your comments on Valentine's shopping list. In my work on Maureen Duffy, I found one of hers from 1961, and it was quite touching, and also, of course, so banal. What was it that prompted your comment that there was the book itself in that shopping list? Allowances made for frivolity.
Well, what I thought about it was that it was rather extraordinary in that in miniature, it did kind of touch on so many of her great interests. So, the bullets, she had a great fascination with guns. She was well aware of the Freudian aspect of this. She liked guns. She also collected daggers. But so there's that. And also the fact that she originally wanted to join this, to volunteer for the Spanish Civil War, actually as a combatant. Early on, they were miliciana, were female fighters. And I think she was very jealous of the artist Felicia Brown, who was actually the first English person to be shot there in Spain. Not as a combatant, in fact, but so there's that, and each little aspect of it is like that. It branches out into ever greater aspects of her life. So I'm sure, Lawrence, you can imagine doing the same thing with Maureen's shopping list, which we won't ask since Maureen's watching as well. What is on that shopping list?
Yes, exactly. You never know who's also in attendance, but I love that. And biographers asking biographers questions. And I mean, it's not an original concept, but you know, to think of a shopping list as a found poem and extrapolating out from there in the way that you discuss Valentine's poetry as well as autobiographical, but also story making, etc. So thank you both so much for being here this evening. Mia, I want to say thank you for getting up early, for Skype, from zooming in from New Zealand, for putting up with the technical freezing. You did wonderful speaking through, so thank you so much. Is there any closing remarks that you'd like to say before we sign off?
Is that
Thank you
Mia?
all for coming. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Frances.
Thank you so much, Mia. It was brilliant. You did so well.
Thank
All
you
the
so
way
much.
from there.
Any closing remarks from you, Frances, as well?
I'd just like to say thank you so much, Erica. It was so brilliant. It's a real honour for me to have my book launched at Gaze the Word. I'm very, very happy with it. And thank you so much.
Oh, it's our absolute pleasure. We're so glad to be able to do, you know, a few pieces still during these pandemic times, even though our doors are open again. It's wonderful to reach people. I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chats from various people, including people in the United States. So that really is the joy of the creativity of this moment, is that we get to be together globally to talk about books, to talk about incredible people who lived transgressive lives. So thank you all for being here. We'll sign off. Take care of yourselves. We hope to see you through the doors of Gaze the Word soon. And if you're not able to, do check out our online shop. We wrap everything and write a personal note. We love to be in touch with you. So do take care, and thank you all. Bye-bye.